Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, whenever and wherever you are listening. This is an episode of the Two Lost Souls podcast, and in this episode, we will be discussing the difference between working as a high-intensity CBT therapist and working as a clinical psychologist. It's just me in the therapy room today. The sensational Michelle Sudbury is away on holiday somewhere, so we hope that she's having a wonderful time. And sadly, the fabulous Fiona Greenhouse, who sometimes steps in for Shell on this show, wasn't available. However, this means that we can keep things nice and short before our interview today. Just the usual housekeeping stuff to remind you of. Please sign up to the mailing list at twolostsouls.co.uk. Not only would you find out about episodes of this pod before anybody else, but you will also keep up to date with some very interesting projects that we've got going on in the background. One involving the KSA and another involving a new website that we're working on and some new website features that we're working on at the moment as well that we're really excited to bring you. So please sign up at www.twolostsouls.co.uk. Don't forget to email hello@twolostsouls.co.uk with any suggestions that you have for future episodes, items that you'd like us to cover, guests that you'd like us to feature. We do have some amazing episodes in the works. We have an episode on ACT that we're looking to bring you, and episodes on transitioning from being a therapist to being a supervisor, and episodes on developing materials for CBT therapy. That being said, we would love to hear more about what you want to hear, so please give us a shout, let us know. But without further ado, let's bring in our guest. So we have the pleasure of being joined in the therapy room today by former PWP and high-intensity CBT therapist, Dr. Shah Alam, who is now, you may gather by his title, an HCPC registered clinical psychologist who's trained in CBT and EMDR. He is also one of the Valued Voices mentoring scheme coordinators who are passionate about widening access to careers in clinical psychology. Dr. Shah Alam, thank you for joining us. How are you doing today?
Yeah, I'm doing good, Ravi. Thank you for having me.
No worries at all. Thank you for joining us. I suppose to start with, in terms of your history, Shah, there is a brilliant article that the British Psychological Society did, an interview you did with them a few years back. And the headline I really took from that was that you didn't really see anyone who looked like you in the sort of professions that we do. More recently, there's been this prevailing thought of you can't be what you can't see. And so I'm curious, what is it that inspired you to enter this line of work despite not having that role model?
It was, I think, an experience that I could hear from my peers as well, and people who are in the profession now, that training, even doing undergraduate psychology, being one of the few men, being one of the few Asian men in a cohort of sort of 30 plus, it can feel very lonely. And I think that for me, I always knew that I wanted to use my degree. Like I wanted to work with people, I wanted to do something where it'll be kept, interesting, exciting. I can continue to learn, continue to develop. But I think just looking around me was mainly a very white profession going into psychology. And I knew for me, I wanted to make a change. Like I wanted to make a difference. And I guess back a long time ago now, when I was studying undergraduate psychology, I guess the message that we got was, don't do it. It's too difficult. You won't be able to do it, which was a very disheartening message to hear, not to even try. But I think what really motivated me was that lack of representation, that there aren't many of us, there aren't many people from South Asian communities who would like to do psychology and actually make it to the profession because of the barriers that exist. So rather than that putting me off, I used that as a way of motivating me to go into the profession and to train. I didn't have clinical psychology as the end goal. I thought, let me just take it step by step. And I guess I was initially a support worker, and then that's when I became a PWP. And I think that was a key step in then me continuing to train and work as a therapist.
You've mentioned some very significant challenges there. One of the first words you mentioned there was it can feel really lonely. And you mentioned that particularly from people who are in theory meant to be guiding you, shepherding you towards a career that you value, the message you were receiving was, it's too difficult, don't do it. What is it that got you through those moments? What is it that kept you going in pursuit of this career that you're now in?
So I think for me, I always would work hard. I knew that I always wanted to, study hard, work hard. And I guess that's a very, it's a common message we have growing up in an Asian household, right? Like grow up, study hard, work hard, because our generation parents get it. They came here, I really need to work hard. And that's was instilled in the next generation. So I always knew I wanted to really sort of work hard, put my all into whatever I can do. And I guess I had really good support in terms of friends on my course and also family as well, who initially didn't really know what psychology was. When I told my parents, they were like, oh, what is this? What can you do with psychology? Initially, I guess the plan was to be a medical doctor, but that wasn't going to work out because I was really bad at chemistry. Then I thought, you know what, plan B, I chose psychology as one of my subjects and I really am interested in it. It is a bit of a risk. And I guess what was helpful was that even though my parents didn't understand it, they said to me, as long as you know that's what you want to do and you can make a career for yourself out of this, then go for it. So even though they didn't quite understand it, I had that support around me that okay, do that, you go for it if you think you can go down that career path and do something that you want to do. So I think that helped me and didn't sort of turn me away from sort of being curious about what that career path where it could take me. So I guess it was partly just finding psychology really interesting at university, but then I guess taking it step by step. Like I never had it as an end goal that I'm going to become a psychologist, but I knew I wanted to work with people and just thought, let me see where my journey takes me. And just step by step, I got to this as an endpoint. But I think the key things were support from people around me, but also knowing that I wanted to do something to help my own community, because there aren't many of us, there aren't many Bangladeshi psychologists or Bangladeshi male psychologists. So I knew a really big driving factor throughout, and even now actually, is that representation of men in the profession and men who are South Asian or specifically Bangladeshi in the profession and wanting to bring that representation to the profession. So that's a big factor as well that really got me going and continues to keep me going now.
Got you. I can really imagine it from the client's perspective, it being very helpful to talk to someone who just gets them, gets all that kind of cultural context, understands the history, understands what the wider culture would have been through historically that's kind of led them to this point and the way they may be thinking and feeling in this moment. One of the stepping stones that you were on the path to becoming clinical psychologist was high-intensity CBT therapist. And you mentioned that being a psychologist was never really the end goal, per se. When is it that you decided that high-intensity CBT was a potential route for you? What is it that made that an attractive pathway for you at the time?
Yeah, so I think going back a little bit, Ravi, when I was a PWP, so I mentioned I was a support worker. So then I was at a bit of a crossroads where I was thinking I was a healthcare assistant on a mental health ward. I was working with teenagers at the time. And I thought, okay, what's next for me? And I applied to either go down mental health nursing route, or then I came across this role, PWP, or psychological wellbeing practitioner. It is brand new, didn't really hear about it, didn't really know what it was, just Googling, and I came across it and I read it and I thought, oh, this sounds really interesting. And I knew what tipped it to go towards the PWP compared to the mental health nursing route was how I knew I wanted to learn more about therapy. So I wanted to learn more about this therapeutic skills. And I saw on the ward that all the great work that my colleagues were doing, but I saw that there's so much that nurses do that I feel like I wanted something that was a bit more specifically focused on therapy and learning about CBT. So I applied to the PWP role, and I hadn't known any PWPs. I didn't know anyone who was in that role. This was, when was it? Back in 2014, 11 years ago, yeah, so quite a long time ago. And then I got the PWP role, and as intense as it was, it really took me out my comfort zone. Like it really was intense, high caseload, I think I learned the most from that role, and I still use the skills that I learned in that role even now, 11 plus years on. So I think I found that even though it was intense, it was one of the roles that I actually learned so much from. And I was then thinking about next steps. So just slowly, I was in the role coming up to 2 years, and some of my colleagues, they went into like senior PWP roles, but I was thinking about what might be next. And I went for the high intensity CBT route because I knew colleagues who had that path in terms of their career progression. And I really wanted to just learn more about CBT and actually learn more in terms of clinically the population that high intensity CBT therapists work with as well. So, and certain disorders like social anxiety and PTSD that I hadn't been able to work with at the step 2 level. That's what led me to let me see if I can go to that next step and apply to be a CBT therapist. So I think at that point it was the psychologist route or the CBT therapist route that I was considering. And I hadn't done any other roles. I wasn't an assistant psychologist or a research assistant, but I had the PWP role, and I learned so much from it. Really, really great team that I worked with as well. And then I sort of thought about the next step, and that's what took me to becoming a high intensity therapist.
Oh, amazing. I mean, you mentioned there that the kind of pathways available to you at that point, or the pathways that you were considering, were either high intensity CBT or psychology. What at that time swung your decision towards high intensity CBT as opposed to psychology at that particular point?
I applied to both. I knew that the high intensity applications were opening up, and I knew that doctorate applications were going to open up, or they opened up beforehand, I think. So then I thought, let me try to apply to both. So I applied to both, and I had interviews for both as well. But then in the end, what happened was I got a place on the CBT training, and then the doctorate, I was offered a reserve place, but I didn't quite make it that year. But actually, in hindsight, I'm very happy it worked out that way, because what I was able to do is actually learn one module in depth. And I did my training at King's, and there was really speakers who have developed models like David Clark actually came and taught us CBT, and who better to teach you a model than the person who helped develop it. So actually it really worked out, because it put me in a place where, as intense as that year was with the high intensity training, I really learned CBT inside out and had cases where I can purely use CBT, where when I did then go on to the doctorate, it actually put me in a really good position where I had these core strong CBT skills that I think would have made that further training a lot more difficult if I hadn't done that.
I can imagine feeling quite starstruck as well if you've got like David Clark standing in front of you presenting stuff. How did you cope with that?
Yeah, I think it was quite it was really exciting actually to have people like Nick Gray, David Clark, and talk about their models and CBT and the protocol. And I think that's what really made the training exciting. Like, again, I think all throughout my trainings, I've had really good cohort, a really good group of people who have the same aims and really excited about learning. That's a big thing that made the learning and the modules actually come to life. That yet the speakers came and spoke to us and gave us some tips about using the modules, and we had like supervision groups, and we'd have to share recordings, which would always make us uncomfortable, but was always, no matter how many years I play recordings and never get used to hearing my own voice, but it really helped with learning. Even if I didn't do the doctorate, I think that training is probably one of the most useful trainings I've done. Even though it was intense, it was actually so useful in terms of the quality of teaching and being able to like live use what you've learned and put it into practice.
Definitely. You've used the word intense to describe it there. How challenging did you find that step up from step 2 to step 3 in terms of the work that you were doing, and how did you cope with the increased intensity and sometimes the increased stress that it brings?
I remember feeling really de-skilled. Like I don't know what I'm doing, like I have no idea. And it almost felt like that 2 years I was a PWP almost didn't happen, and I was coming into it. And I thought I was alone in that, but actually speaking to some of my colleagues on the course, a lot of who were previous PWPs had a similar feeling. So I guess that was nice to see that, okay, this isn't just me. But someone said this to me, I think someone who had done that training and who was a PWP before, they said, oh, it's almost like sometimes you sort of unlearn some of the things, but then you learn it again. So also like you might remold in a way. So I think in that way, it was useful to open up that I had the PWP training, but then being given more time as well in sessions and being able to have more sessions, it allowed that space to open things up more. And I think, yeah, we did lots of role plays and the recordings. And I think that that's what I really liked about the approach with CBT, that it does sort of really focus on those ways of learning. And I think those are some of the most effective ways of learning, that even though it might take us outside our comfort zone, it is really beneficial to get feedback on. So it was intense in that way in terms of the workload and the change in terms of the cases that we work with. But I think I did like having a bit more time. So that sort of balanced out where it was more complex, the population that we worked with at step 3, but by having more time, it allowed us to open things up a bit more within the work that we did. And I guess in that way, not having as high of a caseload that I would have had at step 2, that again was something that was helpful, that, you know, you see less people, that there might be more complexity in those presentations, but I think that sort of evened out. But having, say, those clear protocols or something that I think during my training I really went to as a way of guidance in terms of what you might do next in therapy sessions.
And when we get to this point of your career, Shah, I mean, we spoke about undergrad earlier on and, you know, being sometimes the only male, sometimes the only South Asian male. When you get to this point where you are training as a CBT therapist, then practicing as a CBT therapist, what does the landscape look like at that point for you?
Whether it's my undergraduate or PWP training or the CBT training, something that I never really thought about questioning. And looking back, it's almost like I wonder why, you know, I noticed it, but I never sort of questioned it. I just thought, you know, it's just like that. That's just how it always is. And I guess what really opened my eyes up was 2020, you know, pandemic, the murder of George Floyd. And I think this really got me to, for a lot of people as well, it really got me to question, you know, why is it like this? And why is it that, you know, I don't, rather than me accepting it, it's not something that I need to just, you know, accept like I can start to question it and raise it as an issue and try and maybe think about what can be done about it. But it was a similar experience where, yeah, I probably was one of either the only or one of the few men. And then going further, thinking about a man who is South Asian, I was probably one of, I think PWP, I was probably the only one. My undergraduate, I was the only one. And then I think my CBT training, yeah, I was the only one as well. So I think it is seeing how it was a commonality. And I think that I did take it as it is just like that. But I think when I started to question it, it got me even more motivated, you know, that yes, it is like that, but I shouldn't let that put me off from going into the profession. But can I go into the profession and try and do something about it? And what I did start up when I qualified was a space for South Asian men. So men who are aspiring or qualified therapists, just like a network. I created it when I qualified because that's what I realized, you know, wouldn't it be great just to have a space where men who are aspiring or in the profession could just connect? So then after I finished, I thought, let me do something about it. And then I made a space and it's been going for 4 years, 3 years, I think now. And it was just a network. And I think that's just something that, again, I didn't let it put me off, but rather use it as, you know what, I'm not going to just accept it. Let me do something about it. And then I made a sort of network and a space. Yeah.
Wow. I mean, in the profession that we're in, sometimes we're forced between this choice of, do I observe or do I act, to build that sort of space and to clearly plant this seed, and more than plant the seed, actually grow the tree of increasing representation of particular communities within this profession is an amazing thing to do. And we'll come back to that shortly. When it comes to the high intensity CBT stuff, how long were you practicing as a high intensity CBT therapist for?
So this is the interesting thing. So as a CBT therapist, with the training. So as soon as I finished the training, I got onto the doctorate. So I was a CBT therapist, but alongside the doctorate, I was doing CBT work. So I finished the high intensity training, and then right after that, and this is when they didn't have that rule of how long you need to wait. So then I got onto the doctorate, but alongside the doctorate, I was doing small bits of private work as a CBT therapist just to get my accreditation and get my hours up and things like that.
Got you. And you referenced that rule there. So I think it's 2 years, I think, that people generally need to wait in order to like recoup funding and all that stuff, and then they can pursue extra training, I think. Is that right?
Yeah. So I think it came in place maybe a few years ago, but I think I had done it just before, or maybe a year or so before that rule came into place. So I guess I understand, because I guess the funders did notice that people were moving on from one career quite quickly and they want to try and retain people. But I guess it does, people who are wanting to progress into different roles, I think that, or maybe change into different roles, I guess it does take a bit more time for that. But in a way, I guess, even when I look back to me being the PWP role and me being there for 2 years, there was so much I learned. So in a way, I'm glad that I had that time. So I didn't go from being PWP for like a few months or like a year and then go straight into the high intensity, because there was a lot that I learned in that time. So if there are people who are listening to this and are in that 2-year period and are wanting to go into a different role, I'd say, just try and make the most of that time and see what more you can learn in that role, because there's always so much. And if you're in a service, think about what opportunities there are, if there are certain things that you want to get involved in. Because I think that when I look back to when I was a PWP, there were sort of community initiatives and work in the Bangladeshi community that I wanted to do that I hadn't done yet. So there was a lot to sort of get involved in that I wanted to do as part of that sort of learning.
We're spot on. And I think when I hear about your experience, Shah, I hear about sort of building foundations and then building on top of that and building on top of that. I get the sense that in a way everything was sequential, in that if we drill down deep enough, we can probably find a thread between some of the work that you're doing today and that initial stuff that you were doing even before you were a PWP, actually. And so I think to echo your sentiments there for listeners, even if you want to move on and even if you're getting itchy feet, explore your surroundings, explore the role that you're currently in, and without wishing to sound too calculated or mean in the way I say this, use it to your advantage. Build what you want to build from that and get the experience that you would like to develop for your future. It's okay to be kind of selfish about this sometimes and build almost this portfolio of experience that you want to build for yourself. You're on the high intensity CBT course. At the end of this course, you basically get onto the doctorate, as you mentioned. Was the high intensity course pre-designed as a bit of a stepping stone for you at that point?
I think it really put me in a good place to go into the doctorate. I think it was a good, and even with like the interview for the doctorate, because I had all this knowledge of CBT in my mind, like formulation and therapy and models, that I didn't need to revise or go over anything because it was already in my mind. So it really helped me with my interview as well. And that second year where I applied to the doctorate, I didn't have any expectations. I didn't even tell anyone. I didn't tell anyone because I knew so much pressure surrounds it. So I thought, you know what, I'm not going to tell anyone. The only person I told was one good friend who was on the doctorate to the course that I applied to. I'd rather just keep this as something for me. And if I get on, I get on. And if not, then I'm doing the CBT training. I'm really happy with it. And there's so much I'm learning from it. So I thought, and I don't know if I didn't get on, if I would have tried again, I'm not sure. But I was doing the CBT training, applied, and I don't know how I did this because it is intense, the application procedure itself for the doctorate. So I sent it off whilst balancing the CBT training, got an interview, told no one that I had an interview. I remember one of my colleagues had an interview as well, and I knew she had that interview and I didn't say it. Like, we saw each other and she was really surprised. But it actually helped because you could ease each other's nerves in the waiting room. So I think that doing the CBT training, definitely it just helped so much with clinically knowing CBT, having examples of cases of people that have just was working with and being able to talk about assessment and formulation and really bring that knowledge that I was learning really, fresh in my mind and bring that to the interview. So it helped so much. And even with starting the doctorate, I know some of my friends and peers, everyone comes from different backgrounds, pathways. Some people were more research backgrounds. Some people hadn't worked much clinically. So I think doing the training definitely put me in a good place. And even if I hadn't done the CBT training, and if I had been a PWP, and then if I did go into the doctoral training, I think even that experience would have still put me in a good place with the clinical skills that I continue to take forward during that training.
You've spoken there about some of the commonalities between high intensity CBT and clinical psychology, both in terms of terminology, so formulation, something that's come up a few times, for example, also that sense of actual patient-facing clinical work. What are some of the differences you've found between working as a high-intensity CBT therapist and working as a clinical psychologist?
I speak to a lot of people thinking about their career paths and a lot about this, just for them to consider it, because it's different for everyone. I think it really is up to what the individual values in terms of career steps, pay even, and how long it takes to train. So even with the training path, CBT therapist, you train for a year. It is intense, but there's so much that you learn in that year. And then your training, if it's with the NHS route, you're band 6, and then you go on and you're able to work as a band 7. But I know that then with the doctoral training, it takes 3 years. And I saw this when I finished the CBT training. A lot of my friends then went on to band 7 roles, whereas I had to then still continue at that band 6 during the training for another 3 years. So that's something really to consider in terms of the financial and the time it takes to train. Whereas the doctoral training, it is 3 years. You need to do a big research project as well. You have placements throughout the 3 years across a range of different settings, from CAMS to adult mental health to working with older adults or people with learning disabilities. That's a difference in the training route itself, that is a lot more varied in terms of the populations we work with, the time it takes, and I guess financial implications as well. I guess both of the trainings are funded, so there aren't any sort of course fees, and you get the salary that I mentioned as well. In terms of practice, I guess it is seeing how when you're training to be a CBT therapist, it is, CBT is your bread and butter, and that's the main, unless you've trained in other approaches prior to that, but CBT would be the main model that you use. Whereas working as a clinical psychologist, you may integrate approaches, or you might work more broadly, and you might learn about other ways of working. And there is that sort of scientist practitioner research element that the doctorate brings with it. So doing the thesis and using that research knowledge to do further research after you complete the doctorate as well.
Can I ask how you navigated that, Shah? Because I'm conscious that obviously you did an undergraduate degree in psychology, which, any BPS accredited degree will have research methods components to it throughout the entire 3 years. But I'm conscious that following that, you kind of step away into these patient-facing roles. And I'm wondering, how well equipped did you feel to take on like a major research project as part of the doctorate?
That was a big element of the doctorate that really worried me. And it was really like, can I do this? Because I'm not the strongest researcher, and I haven't been. And exactly as you said, the last time I would have done proper intense research would have been my undergraduate. And I remembered SPS and all that stuff, and it was giving me a headache. But I remember that was the main time when I did research, and that was the thing I was quite worried about. But again, anyone listening to this, I'd like to just give that message to not let that put you off. Like I wasn't a strong researcher, and my thesis was qualitative, so it was interviews, because I knew I wanted to not go anywhere near numbers and stats. So I went and again, this was even way back, my interest with the Bangladeshi community. I did my thesis looking at Bangladeshi men and mental health in the community. So I was able to think about my thesis idea with one of my supervisors at university and do something that was aligned with my interests, but also something that I knew would be in line with some of my strengths with doing research as well. And I actually hadn't done a full qualitative piece of research. That was the first time. So I was able to actually do it pretty well and learn about it. And this is someone who was quite a novice researcher at that time. So I think you're not expected to have like some grand knowledge of research going into the doctoral training. If anyone does go into it listening, you are expected to just have the undergraduate level knowledge as a minimum. So there isn't any expectation to have further knowledge other than more than what you would have covered at undergraduate level.
Got you. Okay, that will probably be music to several people's ears who are listening. It's definitely music to my ears as someone who, remembers doing research methods as part of an undergraduate degree and remembers the shivers that ran down my spine every time I opened SPSS. It's good to know that they're not expecting someone to be an expert sort of walking in with that. You spoke a couple of moments ago about how obviously high intensity CBT is very much using CBT. And I suppose we're lucky in that the cognitive behavioral therapies are quite a wide field of tools, techniques, waves, all on their own. And it allows us to kind of pick and choose a variety of different things to suit the client that sits in front of us in any particular moment. You then embark on this doctorate training that allows you to build, I suppose, another toolbox around the toolbox, I guess. And so I'm wondering that as a clinical psychologist, what does, I suppose, sticking to the model look like? What are the sort of broader integrative approaches that you may use alongside CBT? And I'm wondering how much freedom you have to adapt therapy compared to a high-intensity CBT therapist.
Yeah, that's a good question, Ravi. And what initially comes to my mind is that I feel from my experience, so this is talking from my sort of lens and where I'm coming from, and the services I've worked in, I feel like a large factor is the service and how much flexibility the service allows, and also supervision and supervisors. I found and this is how I practice as a supervisor as well, I always go by the person's goals and what is it that they want to work on. And with then using all the tools that I have, how can I help them to get closer to that? And not saying anything's wrong with sort of sticking to a model and following it step by step and sticking to a protocol. You know, we know the benefits of that. We know there's an evidence base for that. And I guess I would hold both in mind. I can see the benefits of structure and sticking to that. But I also can see that flexibility is needed, especially when we are working with people from different communities where we know the evidence base wasn't developed with different communities. There has been some research, but there needs to be more. So I think what I would say is I always have my foundations in CBT, but I guess over time, what I found is I've been able to add to that. And I think it's not to say that I bring all of that to each person I'm working with, because that's just going to be overwhelming. It's maybe just thinking about some of the tools I have, and based on the person I'm working with, rather than them matching the tools, is how do the tools match them and what they're working towards and what their goals are. So at the moment in my current role, I'm training in a therapy called CAT, so cognitive analytical therapy. And I find that that's such a great approach because it combines CBT and psychodynamic therapy. And it's like a bit of a good mix between the two. So I'm able to think about practically the tools that CBT brings, like, you know, graded exposure, thinking about behavioral activation or behavioral experiments, but then able to bring more attention to the process in the room with the client and some of the dynamics between them and the relationship between the therapist and the client. And I think that this training that I'm doing, it sort of matches up my history in CBT, and I guess more what I'm currently learning and what I'm wanting to focus more on the relational element of some of the work as well. But I think that's a good sort of combination of some of the CBT skills that I have. And I guess with some of the population I work with now, which is in complex trauma, it's a really nice approach because it helps to bring that CBT knowledge and some of the models there, but just to combine it with a bit more of a therapy that's relational. So I find it a nice mix between the two. But coming back to your question, I think it really does depend on the service and how much flexibility the service allows, but also in supervision as well, what kind of supervisor you might have, because then they might guide in terms of what's done in the work. So I think, I wouldn't say there's one that's good, one that's bad, not at all. I can see there's benefits in both. I saw when I was working in talking therapies settings, people would benefit from sticking to that evidence base. But I think with the population I work with now, I think I need to be a lot more flexible, a lot more integrative as well with how I work. So I might think about CBT, but I might then try and bring in other ways of working, and the CAT training that I'm doing is a nice sort of marriage between some of these approaches.
That sounds fascinating, because I suppose on the face of it, one might think CBT and psychodynamic approaches to be completely chalk and cheese, right? Like if you think one being very close to a modern evidence base, very kind of target driven and quite time limited, the other one, you know, having a reputation as going on for years and years and years, and you kind of sit in a room exploring stuff with sometimes quite a slow outcome to it. It sounds fascinating that they've kind of been able to marry elements of the two into something that sounds very explorative, but also something that still gets the client to where they need to go. When it came to your doctorate, what were the other approaches that were taught on that doctorate at the time?
Yeah. So, and I think this is something with the doctorate that I experienced this, and a lot of people who I speak to, because of the doctorate and how much there is to cover, is often that you are introduced to a way of working, and that, say, for example, if it's DBT, or if it's like compassion focused therapy or dialectical behavior therapy or acceptance commitment therapy, like you may be introduced to it, but it's really up to you to do further reading about it. And it really, a big factor in how much you might read up on it is your placement as well. So say if you're introduced to, say, DBT, and then you're working in a service where DBT is used a lot, then you might learn more about it and the protocols and how to do DBT. So I guess some of the approaches maybe CBT and some of the other third wave approaches that have come that I mentioned, but then there is also narrative therapy as well, which I think has become a lot more popular with services who work with communities as well and work out in the community. There are often groups now that happen using like the Tree of Life and other methodology that has come from narrative therapy. So I think that thinking about the narrative work, that really again helped to thinking about the stories and ways that people and things that they have been through, and other ways that we can help people that isn't so much focused on the solutions or the doing, but it might be like another way of working where we don't have to always, because I think, let me sort of come back to what I'm saying with CBT. I think that training in that has been so helpful, but I think what I have noticed is sometimes I can so much get lost in going into the solution, like, okay, let's go and do and do and do, whereas actually remembering that that's not the only way of doing therapy has been something that's really helped me, like to slow down and actually just being. And even if you're not doing something actively with a worksheet or something, that's still useful. So I think that's been a real big shift in remembering the other approaches that I've learned during the doctorate, that CBT, as much as that's my foundation and I know the benefits of it, I can remember some of the other ways of working and how it doesn't always have to be so much focused on the solution or the content of what we're doing. We can just pause, we can sit back. And sometimes the most powerful thing I've seen is the actual relationship with someone and just being in a room with them and listening to them. And that we don't have to work on a task that is so, like, even the most powerful thing is the relationship. And I think that's been a big learning that's come a lot more to the surface now, I think, for me.
I think that's an amazing reflection. I'm wondering how much of that is also linked once again back to being a PWP, because I get the sense that as a PWP, lots of the remit is, okay, I hear this is what's happening, here's the technique that I should be giving you at this point. Whereas I get the sense that at this point, you're feeling a bit more freedom to just sort of swim in the room, actually, and just feel where those currents are taking you both, rather than feeling as though you have to fix everything right then.
Yeah, that's a really nice way to put it. And I think that even with the training I'm doing now in CAT, the cognitive analytical therapy training, that's a real focus on it, that you may, think about the content, but pay a lot more attention to the process in the room and what's happening in the room. And I think that yeah, it really opened up even ways that I question in assessments or just paying attention to other things. That it doesn't have to be even the things that I express with words. It might be a felt sense or sort of things that come up in the room with someone. So I think that it's really thinking about, I guess, CBT and the benefits in that training and how much I learned. I guess now it's really helped me open up a bit more that there are those skills that I learned from training in CBT, but now it's sort of opened up even more ways of working and thinking about an individual and ways to sort of support them, which doesn't have to be just sticking to one model, that I can sort of think more broadly with them.
The thought just crossed my mind as you were talking there. How much of that is also fostered by a change in atmosphere? Because by that I mean, most of us, particularly high intensity CBT therapists and PWPs, are working in NHS talking therapy services, which are often quite limited in terms of the amount of sessions that they grant. Sadly, not always in accordance with NICE guidelines or the manual either. So you find some trusts and services imposing quite strict session limits that are lower than maybe they should. And I'm wondering how much this freedom to kind of be in the room and sit with what's going on and explore that dynamic also comes with being out of that environment.
Yeah, and I think that is it. And I think when I mentioned earlier about supervision and the service, I think the service context has such a big factor. If you are working in a service where for very limited time and it's limited sessions, and it may need to be very close to model and protocol, it's likely not to open up that space to do that further thinking. And again, if you've got less time in supervision, then you may not be able to reflect or open up those reflective questions about those dynamics or what else might be happening with a client in the room. So I think it's for sure shaped by the setting and the supervision. And I think that might be something else that someone might consider as well when they're thinking about career paths. Some people may be happy with that way of working, and that's if that aligns with how they want to work and practice, then I think definitely think about that. But if someone is thinking, actually, I want to think, what other ways are there to work with someone? What more is there, and can I have a bit more space to open up? And then it may be thinking about possible training and other ways of working. And I know colleagues who are CBT therapists, there is that opportunity to train in other ways of working. I know colleagues who have trained in IPT and couples therapy as well. And I know that there's a lot of scope there to do further training as a CBT therapist. But I think if someone is thinking about their career path, it's just thinking about their context, what kind of service someone wants to work in, and if CBT is the model that they see themselves working with, then great. Train if you can to be a CBT therapist, and then there are other opportunities and scope for progression and working privately as well. So there's a lot of opportunity there. I think if someone's wanting to open things up, other ways of working, possibly thinking about CBT, but also learning more about how I mentioned the process and a bit more about, say, psychodynamic principles or narrative therapy, or it might be more systemic ways of working with families and systems, and working with people across the lifespan in different settings, inpatient, outpatient, community. Then it might be that training to be a psychologist, not only clinical, it may be that there are other routes to becoming psychologists, might open things up a bit more in that way. And I guess people also need to think about their personal circumstances as well. As I mentioned, the financial implications, the time commitment, and as well, if they want to stay local to where they're living in, where they are in terms of family commitments and other things. So there's a lot to consider, but I think it's individual based on where someone's at in terms of what if they do want to think about a next step.
Well, yeah, and on that, actually, it's just got me thinking. A lot of people understandably and sometimes rightly claim that the high intensity training year is exactly that, high intensity as a trainee, and it is a very packed year, lots of stuff going on. When it comes to clinical doctorate training, is it the same intensity over 3 years, or does it find a different speed at points?
That's a really, really good question, because I reflected on this, and a lot of friends had a shared experience who had done the CBT training as well prior to doctoral training, that I think it's intense, but I feel like it's a bit more up and down, where the high intensity, I think it is like, yeah, highly intense throughout the year because it's so packed. And then you've got like recordings and then you've got essays and things to write up. Whereas the doctoral training, it is 3 years, but I feel like there are intense points and then things where it might quieten down a bit. You have a bit of room to breathe and think a bit more, and then it might get intense again. And I guess in the final year, it's mainly the thesis that's taking up a lot of the people who are training their headspace. So I feel like it's intense in a different way, but there is a bit more space. And again, I come at this with my own experience, but I guess that's my experience. Like the year of the CBT training, it is very intense. And this, I think, because it is a year, whereas the 3 years, you have intense periods, but it might quieten down a bit more, and then it might ramp up a little bit more.
Got you. That's really helpful for listeners who are thinking about making that decision, and for listeners who've already been through the high intensity CBT course and are perhaps exploring careers in clinical psychology. It's perhaps quite a useful landmark to know that it isn't as flat out as that 1 year was. You spoke about opportunities earlier in terms of modality, in terms of, I guess, the lenses through which we view the therapeutic process and the work that we do. I'm wondering, what are the other opportunities that being a clinical psychologist gives you access to that maybe a high-intensity CBT therapist doesn't? And I suppose in a similar vein, do high-intensity CBT therapists face glass ceilings that perhaps clinical psychologists don't?
I'd say this, I think this comes back to the individual. What I mean by that is, and I guess this is the first thing that's coming to my mind, is whether it's a psychologist or a CBT therapist, I guess the ceiling's there if we only just let it be there. And what I mean by that is or if someone puts the ceiling on us. But I guess what I mean by that is, as a CBT therapist, I think it really comes down to the individual and what they see themselves doing and what they want to do. So say if there's a CBT therapist who wants to then become a supervisor, who wants to then become a service lead, or wants to go on to do some private work or open up a private practice, what's not to say they can't do that? They can for sure do that. So there's all these opportunities. And as I mentioned before, there are all these spaces where they can train further. They can, if they wanted to, they could think about, further training. And I know CBT therapists who also do research as well. So there's not there's nothing to say that they can't do all of these, be involved in things that a psychologist also does. I guess there is some power that the doctor title does hold. I've seen that. And I think that it's it's 2 letters in front of someone's name. So I've seen how much, even an email, like how much it does hold power. And I'm not saying that's the only reason to train to be a psychologist, but it's just seeing that is something that it does hold a bit more power in that way. But for what I say is that the ceiling is there if we feel like there's more that we want to do. So say there may be some people who have trained as a CBT therapist but are very content with where they're at. I'm happy with this position that I'm in and this service that I'm in, and that's it. I'm satisfied with that, and that's all okay. Whereas if someone who is really like hungry for more and is like, you know what, I really want to do more, I think there's nothing to stop them. Like, they can be a lead, they can be a supervisor, they can go on to train and teach on courses as well. I know friends who are CBT therapists who teach on the high intensity training. And then I know when I've been to some of these conferences as well, like BCP conferences and presenting research, and there's so much I think CBT therapists can get involved in that I know psychologists also do.
Yeah.
And I think it is sometimes about just gearing and tailoring where you're at, and then thinking about the next steps and networking with people and services just to really build up your sort of who you know and what they're doing, and if you're interested in something, getting involved in that. So I think with the psychologist route, I think that it comes back to some of the differences. I think it is about the modalities and the ways of working and the populations that people work with and the settings. I know that I might be wrong, but I feel like the CBT therapist role, you may not get that role in all settings, like inpatient community. There may be some, but I feel like that you might have more of a psychologist role in certain settings. But I have seen CBT therapists who don't only work in talking therapies. I have colleagues who are more in secondary care psychotherapy services who are CBT therapists as well. So there can be a variation as well in that way in terms of the setting. It's really up to the individual and where they're at in their career path.
CBT is all about meaning, right? And then so what I'm really hearing you say there is that it kind of depends on what that glass ceiling means
Yeah,
to you. If
yeah,
you're
yeah,
seeing it
yeah,
as something that's very oppressive and something that's
yeah,
designed to keep you down, it'll keep you down. But if you
yeah,
see it as something that you can smash through
yeah, yeah,
and perhaps actually use as a bit of a platform to get to where you want to go, use it. I
yeah.
suppose what I am also hearing though, I mean, you spoke about becoming like service lead, for
Mm,
example, like team lead, service manager, clinical lead, all that stuff. I suppose air gets thinner at the top, right? There are only so
mm,
many of those opportunities that sadly do exist. And I can imagine that, again, with those incredibly powerful two letters, it makes one more of a transferable property, I guess, in terms of being seen that they can apply these skills to a variety of different
mm,
environments. Thinking about this, I suppose, on a bigger scale as well, imagining, I don't know, working in Europe, for example.
mm,
So, someone who is a CBT therapist and who is accredited in the UK, that accreditation doesn't really transfer across to any other countries. But I can imagine
mm.
that when it comes to practicing internationally as a psychologist, it's perhaps a bit easier to do that.
I think that's a key difference as well. I think that the training route, and I guess if someone is practicing somewhere else and how that comes over and how that those qualifications translate over as well. So I think that they are differences that say if someone is thinking about their career path and if they are weighing up what they do, something to consider. And I think exactly as you named in terms of progression, there are certain roles that are advertised for either a psychologist or a CBT therapist, but then there are some that are specifically for psychologists. So I think that is again something else that may influence what roles are available, that there may be a broader pool of roles. And again, this is just from my experience of what I've seen. There may be more broader roles available, say if someone has trained as a psychologist, whereas if you are trained as a CBT therapist, there may be certain settings or certain services that those roles might come up in. So I think the breadth in terms of the roles, because of the psychologist role and the training and the breadth of that training, there may be further breadth in terms of the roles that are available in terms of progression. But again, it comes back to if someone is wanting to progress, questioning, okay, what kind of service do I want to lead? What kind of service do I want to work in? And if it is like a talking therapy service, then being a CBT therapist is very in line with that. But if it's a different service, then it might be some consideration of, is there a gap where I'm at and where I want to get to? And is there anything that I can do that can help me to get to that point?
You used the word progression there. And obviously, when we spoke about high intensity CBT therapists, team lead, service manager, clinical lead, perhaps even higher than that, I guess, if trust mechanisms allow that. What does the progression look like for a psychologist in terms of, is it always client work, or do you end up kind of having to stray from that? Do you end up more in kind of service development roles? What does the future generally look like for a clinical psychologist?
Yeah, and I think this is something for someone to weigh up when they are thinking about career progression and how quickly they go for those next steps. And again, this is only from my own experience, but what I've seen is the more higher up you go, the less clinical the roles become and more focused on management, service development, developing service policies and shaping services. So this really comes down to the individual. I know for me, I didn't want to go up too quickly because I really was learning so much and still am learning from the clinical work and doing that one-to-one work. So there are some roles when you progress that there is still a clinical caseload, but often what can happen is that gets smaller and smaller the higher you go, where it does then focus more on leadership and management, where it all again comes down to the individual and if and when they want to take that step. Some people don't want to deal with all the paperwork and the HR and all of that, and I understand that, and that's fair to them. If they want to focus on the clinical work and having that balance between supervising people but then also the clinical caseload, then that's all for them. Go and stick to that role. But if someone does want something more where they are having a further influence in shaping services and supporting colleagues and supervising colleagues, then they might think about that next step. But from what I've seen, it tends to be that the clinical work might reduce slightly, but then the work around management and leadership might increase. But it's all down to the individual. If they really want to then feel like, I've learned so much clinically, I'm ready to take that step to then take more of a lead in services, then they might then go for that next step. And I guess something else we know is the higher up you go, the less diverse often the leadership and management becomes. So that is another factor of, I feel like we need more representation of professionals from different communities in those leadership positions, because we know there is inequality in that representation at those management levels.
And I can imagine that bolstering the cognitive diversity at that level that's been informed by those different contexts probably helps in developing quite creative and effective services as well. Going back to the differences between high intensity CBT and clinical psychology again, what were the shock factors or surprises from moving from high intensity CBT to clinical psychology that you experienced?
One of the aspects was how there was a lot more space for reflection, so a lot more introspection and a lot more conversations about identity. So thinking about who I am and my identity, I found how there was a lot more space on the doctoral training to open that up, think about that. So I think that was a big difference. And I don't know if it was a shock, but maybe like a good shock, like oh, this has really opened up my way of thinking. And I think I guess it's almost like a parallel in CBT sessions, almost like we know that there's a lot more focus on the protocols and the work. Whereas I guess working as a psychologist, you may have space to open things up. And that is kind of like a parallel with the trainings, how going on to the doctorate, it did allow more space because it is longer, it's 3 years, you have more space to open up that. So I think that was a key difference in terms of being able to reflect more about my identity. I guess we know about that research element as well. So that was a big factor as well, that I know for the CBT training, there wasn't a requirement to do research as part of the qualification, whereas for the doctoral, that was there.
I can imagine that for some people, particularly what you mentioned there around seeing yourself as part of that therapeutic process, right? Because it's a strange thing where we kind of can't do therapy without it. Right? If I'm delivering supervision to someone, I really should acknowledge that they are an active ingredient in the therapy that they're delivering and should really be facilitating reflection on who are you and what are you bringing to the room in that moment and that therapeutic process. I can imagine for some people that can be a really sort of deer in the headlights moment, actually, in terms of no one's ever expected me to reflect on myself as part of this client's journey before. And I can imagine feeling quite vulnerable, actually, when asked to do that for the first time. And I suppose I'm wondering how you felt navigating that part of the journey. And I'm wondering how you acclimatized yourself to it.
Yeah, and I think that with that shift in reflection, that shift in pace, it can be like that, and I almost like, am I thinking about this in the right way? Am I doing this in the right way? And to then think about ourselves, it can feel very vulnerable as well. And I think that what I found was useful is to, I guess, like to lean towards that, to turn towards that sort of, if there was like a nervousness, just to be curious with it. And I guess only not feeling like I need to share things with anyone if I didn't feel like I wanted to, or if I didn't feel comfortable to do so. So thinking about this, and I think what also helped with was having just good friends and peers on my training with me who could actually engage in these conversations together. So I think that is something that helped, having people who are in the same boat on the same training course, and that we could have these conversations about that shift in pace. And if we are feeling really de-skilled about something or not really knowing how to sort of go about a problem or an issue, that we could sort of talk about it amongst ourselves and with each other as well. But it is, I think, and I think this is why it's such a vigorous process with the interviews and the applications, because I think that focus on reflection and being able to reflect on yourself and your experiences is even more sort of highlighted as something that really would make a really good psychologist. That unfortunately we do have psychologists who aren't able to do that, or who haven't actually, who aren't open to do that, which I think it doesn't make sense to me, because as psychologists, we are meant to be able to hold different perspectives and be open and engage in conversations and be curious. Whereas I think it makes things a lot more difficult if we are resistant to that. So I found an approach of being open and curious a way of being able to turn towards that rather than avoid that, if that makes sense.
So often in CBT therapy, we are tasked with the idea of running towards the danger, right?
Yeah.
And it strikes me as being very much it's kind of like I wouldn't expect you to do anything I wouldn't do myself moment with a client kind of thing, in terms of if I'm asking you to sit here and be vulnerable and reflect on something, I kind of have to be able to do that
Yeah,
myself and be
for
able to
sure.
demonstrate that sense of tolerating that discomfort and moving towards exploring something that doesn't sit quite so easily with me, which is it's one hell of a skill. We've obviously spoken about diversity on a few occasions throughout today's interview, and you are incredibly passionate about increasing diversity and within, it sounds like, all mental health professions, as well as clinical psychology. When we look at both high intensity CBT therapy and clinical psychology, where would you say both of those are at in terms of fostering diversity between those two streams? Would you say that one has perhaps done a better job of being able to do that than another at this stage?
I feel that there have been changes. I'm currently linked more in with the doctoral training compared to the CBT training route. So I can maybe speak more about the doctoral training route. I feel like there has been work that's being done in terms of increasing diversity in the profession. An example is the work that I do, the Valued Voices mentoring scheme, and sort of providing mentoring for aspiring psychologists from the global majority who do want to become clinical psychologists. And so that is an initiative that came about from the doctoral courses and sort of mentoring. And I feel like that has helped, but I feel like there's a lot more that needs to be done, where we may increase, and this is again like a parallel to services actually, that there might be a lot done to increase access to the profession, but we need to do more when people do get onto training to support them on those training courses. Similar to services, you can increase access to people from different communities to a service, but it's not great if they're accessing something that isn't equipped to support them. So I feel like a similar thing needs to happen on doctoral or CBT training courses or PWP training, where you may increase the diversity of the trainees who are on the courses, but we need to support those trainees as well when they're on the courses. And by support, I mean, if there are experiences of racism, for example, on placements or on the training course, can those trainees be supported? If they're having negative experiences of supervision or there's discrimination, or I remember I always had this experience where if I was in a lecture, I'd always feel like I'm the one who needs to ask about someone's culture or to raise that question about culture, because I was probably one of the few brown people in the room. So it's almost feeling like, why is it always down to me to ask this question when no one else is asking it when we should be? So I think that there is a movement, and I've seen especially with, I know there's been some increased places. I don't know if this translated also to the CBT training, but I know for the doctoral training, there's been increased places on the training, which is great. But I guess it's this message that courses need to be able to also support those trainees who are from different communities. And we know that the profession is very white still, and it's not going to change overnight. That more needs to be done to, I think, early on as well, raise awareness that these are options of career paths. I knew back when I was in college or sixth form and did A-level psychology, I didn't know what was next. And I feel like I know with my involvement with the doctoral courses, there is an initiative where trainees are doing talks to schools about career paths to become psychologists or other psychological professionals, but I feel like there's more that needs to be done at different levels. And there is like widening access initiatives that are happening on the doctoral courses, but I feel like different stages work needs to be done. So maybe early on when people are thinking about their career path, and then maybe at the undergraduate level, if someone is doing psychology, to just raise awareness of what options there are and how it is attainable. Not that message I got that, don't do it, it's too difficult, like really encouraging people. And then I guess later on as well, like when people are thinking about their career paths, like information being accessible. And I guess the changes in technology do make that available compared to when I was around, like acting like I'm prehistoric, but I guess there's a lot more access to like social media and YouTube and TikTok and things like that. So there's a lot more platforms where people can access that information. And I feel like I'd like to see courses can make use of that and really reach out to people who are from our communities who are thinking about psychology as a profession, that could really get information out there for them to really be informed about the profession and the career routes. And I guess in a way that doing this is a way of doing that as well, right? So doing a podcast, making it accessible, people can listen to it and really hear, which I didn't come across anything like this back when I was training.
What I'm really hearing you say is not just support to get people on to programs that we've done pretty well at now. Now it's about providing them with sustainable support across the lifespan of not only that program, but I guess also their career as well, so they can continue to provide services to people who need them in our localities because they resonate with people who have that natural level of understanding with them. We're at this strange point in the UK at the moment where the words equality, diversity, and inclusion have in some ways become really dirty words. You've got people that rubbish EDI initiatives all the time. You have seeming political situation that is posing a massive threat to initiatives like this that seek to expand the range of people working in professions like ours without me perhaps getting too doom and gloom about it all. What do you see the future looking like in that regard? And I suppose where would you like to be headed with all of that stuff?
Yeah, and I think it is a reality. Like I've heard this so much, and this was even the problem when I was training. There'd be training places, which was great, but then when people would be coming to the end of the training, it's almost like it becomes like a competitive, and it's not a nice sort of feeling like, okay, I want this role, but I want my colleague, my friend to get this role, but there's not space for both of us. And it's almost like it becomes this pitting against each other. And sadly, I remember back when I was coming to that position of finishing my CBT training, there was someone who I knew was told a message that there will be a role for them, but when it came down to it, there wasn't. And I think there are these mixed messages that are sometimes said to people. I've given to anyone who is coming to the end of the training is not to hold out and wait for someone to say to you that there will be a job. Keep your options open, apply to anything that comes your way. So even if someone's telling you, don't worry, apply, there will be a role. Okay, they've said that, but I guess don't take that as 100% fact, because we know things can change and funding can change. So keep your options open, apply for different roles. And I think that's something that I saw, because say if I hadn't gotten to the doctorate that year, then I would have had to move my service, because I knew that. And unfortunately, sometimes it can come down to maybe if someone is more, and I don't know if this is the case, but if someone has an existing relationship with the service, if they've been there longer, sometimes it can be those other factors as well that sort of might tip between who gets a job and who doesn't. But I'd say, that, keep your options open and apply to different places and interview in different places, and then you can see where you may go to. And if you do find that you do need to move, or you didn't get your first option of where you wanted to work, just remember that you can always see if something else comes up. Or if you wanted to, if you're a CBT therapist, if you wanted to do some private work, if you wanted to work online, there are other options with that as well. So just remembering that there are a lot of other options as well of how you can work, where you can work. It doesn't have to be just the NHS as well. It can be in different settings and different ways of practicing. So just remembering that. And I do some teaching on the PWP courses, and I've heard similar things, which it's just, I think that's what, when it comes back to what I mentioned, that more needs to be done to support people to remain in the profession. Because is there a wonder why people are moving on? Because are there any jobs to keep people in the roles? It's like, come on, who's making these decisions? So it's like, you have to think about, yes, that there are training places, which is great, but there needs to be more around sustaining people and keeping people supported in those roles. And I guess, yeah, with the direction that things are going in, NHS is stretched. We know that. I know different trusts as well, funding is really tight. Some places as well are on like recruitment freezes and things like that. So it is really tough. The direction that I'd like things to go in is just coming back to the people. And what I mean by that is just coming back to the ethos of what, talking therapy services or the NHS mental health services are there for. And they are there for supporting the people in the community. And I'd like services just to come back to that focus. That, who is in our community, how is it that we can work with them, what workforce do we need around them to support them, and can we think about flexible ways of working with people, collaborating with other professionals as well, like, so we don't just work in silos. How can we collaborate with other professionals and between services as well to make things more smoother for people? Because we see this sometimes. Someone assesses someone, they're not for them, they referred someone else, they're assessed again, not for them. Sometimes this bounce back happens. So I'd like to see more collaboration between services. And I guess, like, I am seeing already, but I want to continue to see more people from our communities coming into the profession and to be supported into the profession as well. And you named this as well, like, sadly this happens where EDI roles are being pulled, and it's almost like it was a trend, almost like, for 2020, 2021, 2022, okay, now it's past its expiry day almost. And it's just sad that I've heard this happen, that these roles are being pulled. And I guess I'd like to flip it and see how, if those roles are pulled, it puts the responsibility on everyone to do the work that the people in those roles were doing. So those roles were there, but now, even if those roles aren't there, it doesn't give people a space to sort of shy away from doing that work. It's everyone's responsibility now. If we don't have those roles, everyone needs to do that work.
I think that's a really amazing take on it, actually. I mean, you said earlier when you were on the doctorate training, it became this sort of painfully obvious thought of, hang on a minute, like, am I the brown guy that's constantly asking about culture when no one else is, right? Is this only something that's apparent to me just by virtue of my experiences and the lens that I've been kind of forced to see the world through my entire life? And it sounds quite empowering, actually, to go, everyone take it. Everyone take a piece of this puzzle and ask the same questions that I would ask to make sure that the people in your communities are getting the support that they need. And, when we think about CBT as an approach, it's all in the questions, right? And the annoying thing as a therapist is the answers you get are often dependent on the type of the question that you ask. So I think it's about being mindful about the sorts of questions that you're asking and probing in the right ways and in the right directions to facilitate that building of an image that you need to get this journey in the right direction. Speaking of representation there, and to take this full circle as we draw this to a close, Shah, again, you mentioned in a BPS interview that you didn't really see anyone who looks like you in a role like this. Imagine that someone listening to this show right now is in that position. They might have had their hearts set on working in a psychological profession, but there's no one to serve as that role model for them. They don't see anyone who looks like them in a role like this. What would your advice be to them?
I'm just thinking about what I would go back and say to myself as well when I was back as an undergrad, or thinking about like my career path. And I think it always comes back to like you as an individual, like what is important to you, like what kind of values do you hold, what is important in terms of how you work, the way that you work, and what you want to be doing in the future. And if you're not sure, that's okay. If you're not sure, just see where things take you, and not to take no as an answer. If you've got as much chance as anyone else, and if someone's saying to you no, don't use it as something to put you off. Like, use it as almost fuel to be like, you know what, I'm going to keep going and prove you wrong, and I'm going to do this because I know that there's a need there. And that, so I think what I would say if I was to think about this to someone listening is, yeah, thinking about what's important to you, what you value, and how you want to work, and what is it of interest to you, but not to only think about, I guess, what's a good career, but really think about what's enjoyable to you as well. I think sometimes people can be pushed into doing something that because someone else wants them to do that, or that because it's the thing is almost like what's expected for me to do as the right thing for me to do. But really come back to, what am I interested in? What do I see myself doing? What's aligned with who I am as a person and what I value as well? And if people are telling me no, and if I am not seeing someone who looks like me, I guess maybe I can be that change. Maybe I can be that person to bring about that change. And I guess listening to this, know that there's a community of people from different backgrounds, including myself, who didn't think it was possible, but managed to get there, and that there is a growing community as well of people from different backgrounds, not only aspiring psychologists. There's PWPs, CBT therapists, assistants, CWPs, CAPs. There's lots of professionals now in different professions from different backgrounds. So just know that even if you feel like that there isn't someone who looks like you or from your community, that there are people from other communities as well who are happy to support you with your career path. And I'm always happy for people to reach out to me as well, whether it's on LinkedIn or dropping me a message. I'm always happy to give some advice if I can here and there about career paths. Yeah.
What a wonderfully supportive and inspirational note to end on. Dr. Shah Alam, thank you so much for coming on the show today. Where can people find out more about you, the work you do, or any particular items that you'd like to promote at all?
Yeah, no, I'd say just like LinkedIn at the moment. Like, I don't really use X, aka Twitter, anymore. I'm on it, but I don't really use it much. But I'd say LinkedIn. I mostly use LinkedIn at the moment, and I think I've got a website that I don't use much, but my information's on there, and my email address is on there if people want to get in touch. And any questions about like the mentoring scheme that I coordinate, that I often get questions about that, or just questions about career path or things like that. Like, I am always happy to reply to people when I can.
We'll put a few links in the show notes. Dr. Shah Alam, thank you so much, and we hope to have you back on again soon.
Yeah, thank you.
So everyone, very illuminating and informative interview there with Dr. Shah Alam, someone who has attempted to apply for the clinical doctorate before. I found it very interesting in terms of examining both the similarities and divergences between paths in high-intensity CBT therapy and clinical psychology. And hopefully this will allow you listening wherever you are to make an informed decision between the path that you would like to take. For some of you, it might be a pathway and a choice between high-intensity CBT therapy and clinical psychology, or much like Dr. Shah Alam, you might be able to have the opportunity to do both throughout your career. And hopefully this allows you to be forewarned and forearmed about some of the challenges that may face you along both of those journeys. Just to round off today's episode, a big thank you for listening as always. Sign up to the mailing list at www.twolostsouls.co.uk and let us know if you have any ideas for future episodes, or if you have any questions that you would like us to ask any particular guests. Email us at hello@twolostsouls.co.uk. Hopefully, normal service will resume in our next episode with both myself and Michelle Sudbury joining you from the therapy room. But until then, look after yourselves, and we will see you in the next episode of Two Lost Souls.